Hello, everyone. This is World Review with Daalder, a weekly look at news from around the world produced by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. It's Friday, March 8th. This week saw the firing of the starting gun on the U.S. presidential elections, even though it's still 8 months away before Americans go to the polls. Donald Trump swamped the opposition on Super Tuesday, and Joe Biden used last night's State of the Union address to demonstrate that he is very much ready to show up for the fight. Meanwhile, the rest of the world is watching anxiously as America will be consumed by domestic politics, even as the rest of the world is not standing still. Then we'll take a look at the humanitarian situation in Gaza, which is getting from bad to worse, even as ceasefire talks between Hamas and Israel collapsed over the week. Biden, it seems, has now given up on trying to convince Israel to let more aid in and announced last night that he is going to build a pier into Gaza in order to have large amounts of humanitarian aid shipped from Cyprus into the Strip, where hundreds of thousands of people are at the edge of starvation. And then finally, in Europe, there is a growing realization that the war in Ukraine is not going to end anytime soon. With the U.S. deadlocked on providing more aid, Europeans are all debating about what more they can do. French President Emmanuel Macron set off a storm with his suggestion that Europe might consider sending troops and denouncing those who rejected his call as cowards. In Germany, meanwhile, a massive leak of a conversation among Air Force officials has turned into a deep embarrassment for the government. The only person laughing is in Moscow, and his name is Vladimir Putin. Here to talk about these issues are three reporters who cover these stories. Anna Sauerbrey, joining us for the first time, is foreign editor of Die Zeit. Matthew Kaminski, back after a hiatus, is editor-at-large at Politico. And James Harding, editor and co-founder of Tortoise Media. James, Anna, Matt, great to see you, all of you. Anna, great to have you with us for the first time. Matt, great to have you back. James, always great to have you. So let's start, Matt, with politics and politics in the United States. This was the week in which the campaign formally started. Very early for American politics, that we have two candidates that are this early already known, and even more unusual, two people who faced themselves, each other in the last election. Talk a little bit about where we are today, what the issues are, and sort of how we should think about what is happening in American politics over the next 8 months, even as the rest of the world is looking with anxiety at what will be happening.
Well, we basically have two presidents now. I mean, and I think this is, people are saying, what if Trump becomes president? What will it be like? But you are seeing what it is like right now. Trump's impact on American politics, especially American foreign policy, has been quite remarkable in the last couple of weeks. And it came through with Biden's speech last night. There was the issue of the U.S.-Mexico border, which is of great interest in Mexico itself, which is facing its own elections sooner than we are here, where Trump effectively blocked a compromise bipartisan border deal that would have probably done at least something to kind of stem the flow down there. The far bigger issue and the far bigger impact is obviously on Europe. Biden started off with really a fairly robust call that, come on, let's get, arms to the Ukrainians. It is un-American not to support our allies. And at that moment, Speaker Johnson, who was sitting behind him to his left, seemed to be nodding in agreement with. So for a lot of the kind of pro-Ukrainian crowd in Washington, that maybe there's some way that this could be unblocked. And I saw a Biden administration official the day before in an off-the-record session saying, maybe we hope that in March this will get through, but I doubt it. I think that you have America now locked into a race, and in some ways, it's a more dangerous period for America and foreign relations than what's going to then post November, no matter who wins, because Trump has made the world part of our political fracas here right now?
Yeah. So, James, domestic politics is sort of framing American foreign policy in ways that, frankly, I don't think we've seen in a long time. Even in 1940, the election between Roosevelt and Wendell Willkie, there was no disagreement fundamentally between the two candidates of what needed to happen. And here we seem to have two foreign policies being run at the same time. So, sitting where you are, how do you look at this? And by the way, what do governments do in response?
Two foreign policies that you wouldn't expect from two parties. That's one of the things that's so muddling. If you think of the State of the Union last night, you had Democrats pressing for more military engagement in a confrontation with a Soviet-style dictator, and Republicans, in effect, standing in the way. And at the same time, Democrats essentially engaging in a way that would surprise many in the history of that party, with humanitarian aid into Gaza at odds with the position that's been taken by Israel. You might have read both of those things as coming from the other party. And so I think, Matt's exactly right. And your introduction, Ivo, was exactly right, which is we're in this weird world where America stops for the better part of a year at exactly a time, and I expect Anna's going to talk about this, when the world can't afford for it to effectively go home.
Anna, I think this is the problem. The rest of the world doesn't seem to be ready yet to take up the banner that the United States has held high now for almost 80 years, which is marshaling the rest of the world to come together to deal with issues that are out there. And so, when you are talking to your sources in Germany, how are they looking at this period? I mean, everybody knows there's nervous about who wins, but that's 8 months from now. And in the meantime, lots of things can happen. So how do people really look at this, and what do they think they can do about it?
I think on the surface, and that's the official position we hear when we ask about it in press conferences, is that the Scholz government is very confident that Joe Biden will win again, that the cooperation with the American administration has really been this well as with the Biden administration. Scholz and Biden are almost close friends. They come from the same party family. They have a similar look at the world. They have a similar look at the war in Ukraine. They have a similar look at economic policies. So everybody here keeps saying we expect Joe Biden to win this and to continue the good relationship. But of course, behind the scenes and in background conversations, we hear a lot of worry. We see a lot of cold sweat. And of course, Trump's recent remarks at a rally in South Carolina saying that he had told other European leaders in the past that he would encourage Russia to attack Europe in case they didn't pay up their NATO contributions, has again very much put to the forefront of European minds the dangers that lie ahead. And I think there's a gap between, on the one hand, realizing what would be needed, and on the other hand, the period of what would be needed being too short to really achieve it. And I think that's what's creating a lot of discomfort here right now.
Matt, James's point that it looks like the positions between the parties have shifted, certainly on, if you compare the Reagan Republican Party to today's Republican Party, and that's to some extent true. The Biden Democratic Party today is a little different than even the Obama Democratic Party. You could argue, on Ukraine, the Obama administration didn't want to provide lethal aid, et cetera, and certainly wasn't on the forefront of standing up to Putin, at least initially. How does that play out?
James is absolutely right that, and it actually applies to domestic sort of politics too. You've had the Republicans used to say this famous phrase that Republicans fell in line and Democrats fell in love. And it's the Republicans who've got to kind of fallen in love. They cannot kind of rid themselves of this rapture that they have with Donald Trump, despite, and this is the one thing that the Biden folks mention to make themselves feel a little bit better about themselves, that Trump has lost 3 elections in a row, going back to the midterms in 18, obviously he lost 20, and 22 helped them kind of underperform badly. And Democrats have fallen in line behind a president that they all think is diminished, or at least the Democratic establishment and certainly many Democratic voters, to judge by the polls. So it's kind of like, kind of an Alice in Wonderland sort of era of American politics. The one thing that I think is worth keeping in mind, and this is where the kind of the heat of the campaign, when it meets the kind of the reality of sort of governing, no matter who wins, this remains obviously an immensely complicated country. But you hear a lot of talk around Washington now that that if Trump does come back, we sort of know what it will be like. We sort of know that it'll be noisy, but that there will be some adults in the room. There's already talk that Pompeo would be at the Pentagon, that there is that core in the Republican Party, that even though the populist rhetoric on the world is an American first rhetoric, you still have the Tom Cottons, the Lindsey Grahams, even though he voted against Ukraine aid, but still there's an internationalist core within the Republican within the party establishment, surely, that will not do anything crazy. And it's probably not very comforting to I know it's not comforting to Europeans to sort of think that way, but I do think that one does have to separate. I mean, I think the campaign will be very ugly, and I think it'll be a lot more worrying if you're Ukrainian and a European than presumably whatever comes afterwards.
James?
Yeah, I just wanted to, it's a comment, but it's actually more of a question, really, both for you, Ivo, and for Matt, which is about the judgment at the heart of the State of the Union around the link between freedom at threat at home and freedom at threat abroad, which is neat, but I wonder whether it's in tune with where voters are. And I wondered how much voters really care about foreign policy. I was always aware, Matt and I both worked at the FT, and I was always aware that when I worked certainly in Washington, the Financial Times was really played into the White House a good deal in everything but an election year. Once you were talking about world affairs, the administration knows perfectly well that doesn't really move the dial. And I was surprised when I was watching and reading over the last day and thinking about the State of the Union, how much play Joe Biden is giving to Ukraine as an argument for his re-election. And I wondered whether that's a misreading of where the American public is and what really is going to drive this election: southern border, sense of, an economy that may be growing on paper, but not in people's pockets. I wondered whether or not you think that actually foreign relations may be a problem for the rest of the world, but also not necessarily as much of a benefit for Joe Biden as he thinks.
Matt, how do you look at it?
Yeah, I think there's 2 things. One, it is not an election about what's happening in the world. It's an election about what's happening here. And I would even look at the Gaza debate and the debate about Ukraine through a purely domestic prism. Mm-hmm. So Ukraine is essentially, a proxy for why are we spending money on foreigners when we have problems at home? And this is where it gets very easy for Republicans to say, well, until we secure our border, why are we worrying about the Ukrainian border? That's all it really is. I do think Biden's trying to fight back, and I think this sort of linking the sort of fight overseas to the fight abroad is emphasizing this point about you have this guy who is willing to kind of bow down to a Russian dictator, sell out American interests, sell out American allies, and that's the same thing he is doing domestically to democracy. That plays really well, believe it or not, with the Biden core constituency. And the question becomes like, how many sort of swing voters would be like, I don't think we want an appeaser. We don't want a kind of Putin bootlicker in the White House. But that's on the margins. Republicans and anyone who's prone to vote for Trump does not hear that. At the end of the day, I think it does come down to two things. Are people feeling good about the economy? And is the country generally at peace? That will determine this election. And then, and if you're Trump, you got to kind of raise doubts about both those things. And if you're Biden, you're hoping that with the next 6 months, Americans do feel better about what is by far the most successful economy in the world right now. And two, stay out of the Middle East, get disengaged, and make people feel that there's not the conflicts abroad are being handled, but are not sort of affecting people here and will not drag the U.S. in.
Yeah, James, I'd add sort of two things to that. One is, I think importantly, foreign policy doesn't generally determine election outcomes, just as you say. And that's true for all countries, and it's true for the United States as well. The two sort of footnotes to that is that foreign policy is having an impact on how people view the candidates. And clearly on the Democratic side, the problem that Biden is having with young people isn't just a question of age, but has a lot to do with Gaza and the situation there, which is really really problematic for him politically, with Arab Americans who happen to be geographically located in key states, including, of course, Michigan. And if they don't come out and vote because of foreign policy, it may not be something that has a huge impact on the overall popular vote, but it may have an impact on Michigan's electoral vote, and that's how we, unfortunately, elect presidents in this country. So that's one piece. The other piece is there is a very big shift happening in the Republican Party, which is becoming more isolationist and more 1930s. And that's not just Trump, but it is Republican voters, and particularly those who are closely aligned with Donald Trump. So those who have a very favorable view of Donald Trump are against aid, against engagement, are against war, and are very much taken with Trump's not just America first, but America not engaged argument in some ways, and opinion polls show that too. So that's two ways in which it's really hard to figure out, because as Matt, I think, rightly says, how does that play with the middle voter? And this is like all elections; it's about the middle. Our middle voter is going to come and be go one way because they're fear of Putin, or they go the other way because they're disgusted with what's happening in Gaza. I think that's part of why foreign policies are like a little different this time around in the election than the last time around. Anna, I want to bring you in here as well, because get your take on how you look at sort of these foreign policy issues in the election, but also what impact it has on where you are in Europe.
Yeah, I mean, we follow it very closely here, and even though it's not on the top of German minds yet, I think, of course, the expert community and the foreign policy community is following very closely, for example, the Super Tuesday results. And I thought they were rather troubling when you look at the Biden camp, and that the uncommitted movements, or the movements similar to the Michigan uncommitted movements responding to voters being angry about Biden's Gaza policies, are playing out in so many other states too. And as you said, Ivo, it could be the decisive couple of thousand votes in some of the swing states. A question I have as a European, maybe to you, that I can't answer, that you can probably better answer, is what do you think will be what effect could a real ceasefire in Gaza, or the actual developments on the ground, still have on those groups? Are they angry for good with Biden over how he handled this conflict, or could they come back if we have a better outcome, if the humanitarian situation improves, if we have a deal, which sort of does look unlikely today, but if we have a deal over Gaza?
Matt, what do you think on how assuming a ceasefire and presumably humanitarian assistance really getting into how will that play by the time November comes around?
I mean, I think if you're a Biden campaign advisor, and I've talked about this, they just want to get out of there as soon as possible. Don't get involved with Iran. Disengage, and hopefully this goes away by the end of summer as an issue. And then you go to Dearborn and you kind of talk about Trump's Muslim ban every other day, and remind people that this guy's a much bigger threat to Arab Americans than Biden is. But it is a very real concern, to Eva's point. I think this is where, we have a funny, as you know, it's like in a lot of states, in Pennsylvania, how much do Ukrainian and Polish American voters swing one way or the other in a very tight race, where you're talking about effectively thousands of voters in just 5 or 6 states that are going to determine the outcome. So that's why you're sweating these little things, which in a different race and certainly in a different country you wouldn't think very much about.
James, jump in here.
The only thing I'd say, Matt, about that, and this comes from like a place of real inquiry, not real knowledge, I'm just trying to figure it out, is it could be the case that something is creeping up on us in terms of the way in which particularly young Muslims see Western authority, and it's not just Gaza. So it's Chinese treatment of Uyghur Muslims, it's Hindu nationalism and how that plays in India, it's the Rohingya and what's happened, and it's Gaza, and I just wonder to myself whether or not I get your point if I go back to Dearborn and the Muslim ban, but whether or not over time a perception has shifted and, this Ramadan feeling like something's different in the world, even though it's the accumulation of things that have been the same for a while.
I think that's something to watch clearly, Matt.
I think just very quickly on that, I think there is something to watch also around the just dynamics around young voters in general and the issues that motivate them. And I mentioned, that that Republicans fall now in love and Democrats are falling in line, but there's a big shift within Democratic Party and on the Democratic fringes that kind of mirrors what happened to the Republican Party over the last certainly 14 years since the rise of the sort of Tea Party movement. The progressives were not powerful enough to push through their version of a Trump will be a Sanders. The establishment still runs the party. They're still, to use a different metaphor, they're still in the cockpit of the plane, but the passengers in the back are starting to bang down the door. And I think that's the way that I would see the kind of the response among young people to Gaza, that there is a different kind of politics that's taking root in the Democratic Party that is kind of like some sort of mirror image of the Trumpist sort of Tea Party politics that has basically taken over the Republican Party.
That's fascinating. Yeah, Anna, please. I don't want to cut you off.
No, I just wanted to mirror that because I think it's true for very many European countries too. And I think it's true for Britain, it's true for France, and it's true for Germany, that people with dual identities as Germans, French, British, and a Muslim identity have been pushed by mainstream politics to feel stronger about their Muslim identities and are questioning their governments and trying to find a place within the different parties that represents their views and their concerns looking at Gaza. And we don't have, in Britain, we have major elections coming up. I don't know how much that's going to play out there, but it certainly might play a role in the German elections next year because it's really hard to find a party in Germany who really represents those people.
No, I think that's, this is, I think we've hit on an important point. This is not just a momentary blip. This is something that it will have major impact over time. And while it used to be the case that younger generations tend to be more progressive, and as they become older, become less so. After all, the baby boomer generation happens to be a Vietnam generation. It's the same generation, but they have very different views now. It's not clear that that's happening at the moment, that there may be some other forces going on. James, we will go back to this many times in subsequent weeks because, fortunately or not, the election will continue. in the United States. But let's shift to the Gaza piece, which is relevant to the situation, because part of the politics that is playing out in so many countries relates to the incredible situation, which is truly incredible when you think about it, in Gaza, and how we're going to get out of this. And it doesn't seem to be that we're going to do it through a ceasefire. So the question is, what else can happen? So bring us up to date here.
So a few disorganized thoughts, Ivo. The first is just to pick up on a point that Anna made, which is this assertion of religious identity once again in Western democracies. That is a huge and strange thing. I'm Jewish. Last week I sat together with a friend who's a Muslim journalist, and we spent a lot of time talking about our quote-unquote communities and how they were playing out in newsrooms and how those issues were playing out then in our politics. And I was struck that in the UK, when the British Chancellor stood up this week to give the budget, the kind of economic plan for the year, he started with the announcement of a monument to Muslim soldiers in the Second World War. Something deep is happening, and so there's a lens there that is different from the one before. I think when you look at what's happened in the past week, or probably I'd say 2 weeks, in terms of Israel and Gaza, and particularly the United States and the West, there have been two really significant things that have, if you like, cracked the lens. One is that the President of the United States said in a rather off-the-cuff way that he expected a ceasefire within a week. By this Monday past, there would be a ceasefire. And the contours of it were pretty clear. There would be the release of hostages, a large number of prisoners exchanged, and yet that ceasefire didn't happen. And I think that the first lens that cracked was that we were looking at the wrong thing. We were looking at the terms of the deal. We weren't looking at the people making the deal. And the reality is you can't make peace without peacemakers. And whether it's Hamas, who has its interests for the continuation of this war, or Israel, and quite notably people within Benjamin Netanyahu's cabinet, your Ben-Gvirs and your Smotriches, who are also, ideologically opposed to a two-state solution. The finishing line that Joe Biden talks about, that Tony Blinken talks about, that pretty much, David Cameron, the British Foreign Secretary, talks about, is not the finishing line that either of these people, Hamas or the Netanyahu cabinet, have got in mind. So the first thing that was revealed was that the President of the United States had a ceasefire in mind and in sight, but the key players didn't. That is a really deep problem and a depressing problem, because it makes it hard to see how you eventually get to a ceasefire and the road to a two-state solution, or any solution. And then I would say the second thing, which is really extraordinary, is the announcement in the State of the Union about humanitarian aid into Gaza. And you might say, well, it's not that extraordinary. The United States has already dropped aid. There are, hundreds of thousands of people, as you said, on the brink of starvation, and the total breakdown of the infrastructure, for food and housing and energy in Gaza. But actually, I can't remember a time when the United States was putting in surface-based infrastructure to provide humanitarian assistance on the other side of a military that it was providing military hardware to. So it's backing Israel, and it's supporting in humanitarian terms the Palestinians. And the bit of this that I really don't understand, weirdly, Ivo, we spent the morning here looking at old World War II pictures of Mulberry harbors, the way in which the United States put in place, in effect, temporary ports back in the Second World War. Well, presumably when you put these piers or pontoons or ports in place, you're going to need to have military personnel there to ensure their safety, and to ensure that you don't have what's happened when Israel has tried to provide, humanitarian assistance, these terrible scenes with terrible numbers of deaths. The United States is going to be very concerned about the security of its people and the security of the people coming to get aid. it's a very, very risky endeavor and a very important one. It's not that I don't understand the arguments for it, but, when you're saying, that the Biden administration, Matt, its main, objective here is to pull back, the reality is it's stepping in.
Yeah, no, I think both points, James, are extraordinarily well taken. I think on the humanitarian aid side, I would argue that they are still on the wrong side where they were on the ceasefire issue, because the issue, frankly, isn't the provision of aid to Gaza. It is the provision of aid in Gaza, which is, it's easy to get it to it. The question is what happens once it's there, and that problem has a simple solution. There is one party that is trying to prevent this from happening, which has refused to think about how do you govern a country or a place when you have removed the government. And that's a sort of a central tension that I think the pontoon bridge is not going to resolve. But it also, so that's one part of it. And the other, I have this has all the markings of 1982, 1983 Lebanon, where the U.S. thought about doing something that went absolutely wrong when of course the embassy barracks were bombed, and the embassy barracks were bombed with the Marines
and
there.
Eva, can you just explain something here, which is, I think for years people have talked about Netanyahu kind of pulling away US support for Israel. How significant do you think the provision of this humanitarian assistance to Gaza is as a statement of where the United States now stands in the way in which it thinks about Israelis and Palestinians?
It's a great question, Matt. How do you see that? I mean, how do you see the announcement to do this? Which is, I think, as James rightly put it, we're providing humanitarian aid, while on the one hand, which is necessary because the way Israel has fought this war makes that necessary, and we're at the same time we're supporting Israel in fighting the war, materially and in every other way.
I mean, I see it also as a political move. This is kind of the main headline that they got out of a speech last night. It didn't have the oomph that they thought it would. It kind of was like, it's not quite a ceasefire. It's not ending the war. I think the real tension is between getting involved in the particulars what's going on in Gaza, in Israel, which is where the problem in the media is. It's where the humanitarian problem is, and I would say the other side of it is, if you're just imagining in kind of Jake Sullivan's pretty large brain, I think they really do see this in a regional context and see the potential for kind of a regional sort of reorganization that started with the Abraham Accords under Trump, where they want to deal with the Saudis to provide the Saudis security guarantees in return for recognition of Israel. The Saudis really are desperate to get back there. The Saudis haven't said very much about, the crisis in Gaza and have been kind of because that's where their interests lie. They do want to check Iran. There's a much bigger game playing here. And I think that's where they think they should be spending most of their sort of intellectual energy and probably political energy. But the facts on the ground keep getting in the way, and the horrible news out of Gaza keeps getting in the way there. And I think I meant to say is that, they don't want to get sucked into some larger regional war, but they would sort of love to use this opportunity to kind of, obviously the administration, both sides here is like, let's get some two-state solution. They don't care about the Palestinians that much. The Arabs don't really care about the Palestinians that much. Let's try and solve some bigger problems and use this to do it. The problem is that this is the problem of the day, and that's not actually making that eventual outcome any easier, and it seems to be making it harder.
Right, Avens, dear boy, Avens, as a famous British politician once said. Anna, how is this playing in Germany? Because if there's one country in Europe that actually shares in some ways the dilemma that the United States has, which is very strong, visceral support for Israel, for all the understandable historical reasons, and yet the same tension, what is happening in Gaza is tearing at the fabric of its internal society, but also in many ways in every person is tearing that apart. How is Germany reacting to this? How are they looking at their role in trying to address the situation?
Yeah, I think Germany is in a very difficult position because it's really locked in by its historic relations with Israel and its policy of Staatsräson that has been reiterated from the very beginning of this conflict. I mean, I do see some involvement in the German position, especially the foreign minister's language has gotten much harsher when it comes to the Israeli government. She has visited the region 5 times. She has spoken to all the major players around Israel, most of the Arab states, and she has been very outspoken about the humanitarian situation. And we hear in background conversations that the Germans do push for more humanitarian aid also to pass through the Keren border crossing, which according to many humanitarian organizations, would still be the best way to get food and supplies into the country. But I mean, Germany's leverage is rather small, and it has been from the beginning. And I think it doesn't really matter whether she speaks a little louder or uses a little harsher language. I think after all, it's the United States that would have the leverage, and even the United States, as we see now. And I think that the platform and the airdropping highlight that has very little leverage because the Israeli government, as it is under Bibi Netanyahu, just doesn't care. And yeah, I think Germany is trying to do what it can to support the United States behind the scenes pushes for more humanitarian aid, but it can't.
I think this lack of leverage is a key issue. It's not just the Germans, but frankly, this is actually in some sense demonstrates even the U.S. doesn't have real leverage, even though everybody's looking to the U.S. to solve or address this problem. James?
Well, just to say to Anna, one of the things that I'm sort of more and more aware of, Anna, is that we're not together. And this is not just a US issue. This is partly a Brexit issue that the UK is not engaged in, London's not engaged in Berlin and Paris in the way it was. I'm not sure actually that Rishi Sunak has come to Berlin to visit Olaf Scholz. That's quite an amazing thing, the kind of what's happened to the, UK-German relationship. And I know we're going to come on to this in a second. It's obviously a massive issue, in terms of the approach to Ukraine, but it's a massive issue and approach to this too, that Europe doesn't feel as though it's together. And then there's a gulf, that emerges between, across the Atlantic on this too. There's something that's happening here that I think is really significant.
Agree. And
yeah, I think you're right. Yes. Yeah. I agree. I think it's more obvious on Ukraine policies, that we're not together, neither France and Germany nor Britain and Germany. I think it's become a bit easier with maybe the fourth major player in Poland on Ukraine. But yes, you're right, and it's true for Gaza too. I think the UK has been much more outspoken on Gaza, and Germany's just not following along.
Anna, let's stay with you because this is a great way to transition to really. It seems to me the two things that happened. One is this realization, and when you and I were in Munich, we talked about this by the Europeans that, oh my God, we actually might have to do this ourselves, both in terms of defense, but in the immediate instance, Ukraine. But then having realized that Europe needs to step up, there's both the capacity issue and the lack thereof, and now this growing fissure about how to do so. And it's been quite remarkable to have the French president running around Europe talking about all kinds of things and then calling those he disagrees with cowards. And so the tension between France and Germany has been high, but this was quite a week. So bring us up to date about what happened and where you think this is taking us.
Yeah, so we have to go back a couple of days to Monday, February 26th, when Emmanuel Macron had gathered European leaders in the Élysée Palace in Paris. And it was actually meant to be a show of unity and force at a time when it is very, very difficult for Ukraine to hold the front line. They had to give up Avdiivka. They're running out of ammunition. It's really starting to be felt at the front line. And Emmanuel Macron, so what we could read in the press, it was also the idea of Zelensky that he would get people together to show that Europe is still supporting Ukraine. But what came out of it, as you said, was another fissure in the European fabric, the fabric of support. I mean, there are 2 points I think that are a little overlooked that are positive, because they actually agreed on sending more medium and long-range missiles to Europe within that group. And on that evening, that's what he announced in the press conference after the meeting. And what they also announced was that they were starting an initiative to buy ammunition for Ukraine, not just within Europe, but in third countries all across the globe, which is something that France had opposed, speaking of fissures, so far, and which Macron now agreed to. But then he announced, or he was asked by a journalist, whether he would also be willing to send troops to Ukraine. And he said that that could not be concluded given certain dynamics, something a bit vague, which of course was immediately rebuffed by Scholz, who did so on Tuesday and did so again in one of his video formats that he does every week, addressing both German soldiers and the German public with the premise that he will never send troops to Germany. There has been quite a bit of debate, also because the French-German relationship on Ukraine already was a little tense. Scholz had sort of shifted gear in the weeks before the incident. He never mentioned or called out France literally, but he had started to speak about how much Germany is doing, and that other European countries, not naming France, but meaning France, would have to do more to do as much as Germany does. And some have read Macron's response, that as a response to Scholz's growing push towards France. I think it hasn't hurt him. It hasn't hurt Scholz domestically. I think he has actually profited from being able to take that stance. Many social democrats have applauded him. They want him to see. They want to see him going into the campaign next year as the chancellor of the steady hand, somebody who's handling this great European crisis with care and caution. And they think they could actually profit from how he handled this situation with Macron in Paris.
Really, that's interesting that this may pay out positively, because, of course, there's also a big debate going on in Germany about whether Germany should provide longer range missiles, particularly the Taurus missile, a cruise missile that would be more capable than what the French and the Brits have provided, and frankly, the U.S., which hasn't provided any of these longer range missiles yet. Matt, when you know, as a good observer of Europe, of the European political scene, when you look at this in the way that Anna, I think, so accurately describes, how do you see this moving forward? Because there's, in some ways, the domestic politics and political interests of leaders seem to be uppermost, as one would expect anyway, with politicians, uppermost in the mind, rather than trying to come to a coherent policy.
Well, it's just striking kind of sort of the weakness of sort of leadership in the key capitals, and I think this is where Berlin stands out. And Merkel now, in retrospect, had a blind spot for Russia and is blamed for a lot of what's happened in Eastern Europe. But at least, at the time in her long tenure in Berlin, you could say, well, there was a strong leader in Berlin who had a good relationship with Macron, who had a good relationship with Hollande, Sarkozy, a little bit strange. But that sort of Paris-Berlin tie, that is that's been sort of the key relationship in Europe going back to since the end of World War II. And the fact that it's broken, and it clearly is broken, is sort of concerning for how you're going to run the EU, but then how are you going to kind of keep Europe together, especially if you're looking forward to potential Trump presidency. The opportunity you have is that, with the change in government in Warsaw, you now have someone who is very sort of pro-European in power in Donald Tusk, who does, I think, genuinely want to improve relations with Berlin. And there was always this talk of that, Paris, Berlin, Warsaw as being the kind of three capitals. London, less so, James, unfortunately, since you've marooned yourself outside of the bloc. But sort of, Britain's still the kind of key European member of NATO. So I don't know who. The question becomes who changes it. You're not going to change Olaf Scholz as a politician. So I don't know if there's an opportunity for Keir Starmer coming in, or, obviously Macron is trying to say, in my last 3 years in office, I'm going to become, which is the great dream of French leaders going back a long time, become the leader of sort of Europe. But it has to be all of them somehow, because they can't really, there's not a single one that can do it by themselves, it seems.
James, Keir Starmer is going to do this?
Fun of Matt makes a really, really interesting point, is there is a real opportunity here because, listening to Anna, I was like, that is fascinating, the possibility that the way Scholz is playing things right now works for him. I think you used sort of care and caution was your phrase, Anna. And the reason I find that fascinating is there's a caricature of the sort of two leaders in Paris and Berlin. One is that Macron is very irritating, right? And he just sort of says things and assumes that he is the leader of Europe, and that winds everyone up. But that Scholz is very confusing, because there was a moment where people looked at Scholz after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and that whole sense that Scholz had that the world had changed, that there was a shift, there was the Zeitenwende, the times had changed, and that Germany needed to change with them. And that seemed to be a stronger Germany, and a Germany that took greater responsibility for what was happening in the world. And now, Anna, I think the read of it here would be Scholz is saying, look, I do need to be cautious. I do need to be closer to a peace president. And people then say, well, what does that mean? Where's the strength to stand up to Putin? And I think people find that confusing.
Yeah, I think it's two different approaches. The one... what Macron is apparently trying to achieve is saying to Putin, you can never know what we're going to do, like strategic ambiguity. And Scholz's approach is, I will tell Putin exactly what we're not going to do. So he knows. And I'm not sure it's working. I think in the end, if Putin decides to attack, decides to escalate, and the way his talking heads on Russian state television keep saying they would escalate this using nuclear weapons in this conflict, it's after all, it's Putin who decides and who just makes up an opportunity or a cause to do so. It's not how Europeans really behave. It's him deciding whether he wants to do it or not. But I think Scholz thinks it's safer, and I think it does resonate with the German public. And I think it doesn't take away the Zeitenwende. I think the Zeitenwende is real. We are investing in our military, not as much as Donald Trump would like us to do, not as much as many others in Europe. The Baltics, the Poles would like us to do. But Germany's budget is grown. We have 100 billion extra fund, and it's not as speedy as it should be, but it can't be taken back, I think. But I think what Germans also want to see is red lines, and that's what Scholz is giving them. Yeah.
Yeah, and Macron wants to erase red lines. I think that's exactly right. The strategic ambiguity versus strategic clarity piece, and Anna, I think you have both pieces. One, making clear that there are red lines. There's certain things that we won't do, but also we are doing a lot. There is, if you look at what Germany has actually done, both in terms of trying to rebuild its military, we'll get to 2% this year, but rightly, Anna, in terms of supporting Ukraine, it by far outstrips, by far, what any other country in Europe has done militarily, economically, and other than Poland in terms of refugees. 1 million refugees still in Germany. Which in the U.S. debate, when people say, why don't the Europeans do it, sort of forget, if you look at the percentage of GDP being spent in support of Ukraine by Europeans and compare that to the U.S., there's a lot we can do better on that score. Fascinating conversation. We've run way over time, but that's because it's so important to deal with these issues. I want to thank Anna Sauerbrey of Die Zeit, Matt Kaminski of Politico, and James Harding of Tortoise Media for really a great discussion. Thanks so much for joining us, and thank you all for tuning in. We'll be back next week with another edition of World Review. And until then, have a great weekend.